I don't actually agree with that. I think a lot of things have changed. I mean, what I've been talking about today, you couldn't have talked about not many years ago. And now you can talk about it everywhere. So it's true, for example, that, I mean, say take last November. It was a really horrifying month. I mean, the fact that we would it was momentous events that happened in Eastern Europe, no denying it. But the fact that we could celebrate the triumph of, love, nonviolence, and so on, when at the very same period we were carrying out monstrous terrorism and, in fact, destroying Christianity, a battle against Christianity in large measure, passed without comment. Well, actually, you can talk about it now, not among intellectuals. Like you won't find any writing about it, but at the beginning of the month I happened to be in Ireland, and not that it was a deep insight, but I just predicted it. I said, this is what's going to happen in the coming month. November 30th, at the end of the month, I was one of the speakers at the Boston College Memorial, which is the only one I know of, and there was a huge audience, and they could understand, and others can understand. Well, that's changed. Didn't happen before, and there are many other things like it. The country has become a lot more civilized than it was. That's substantially the result of the activism of the 1960s and its aftermath, and it's the main reason why the 60s are so despised. If you read the intellectual culture, that's the time of troubles, kids going wild, what are we going to do, and so on. Well, yeah, they were going wild. They were civilizing the country. That's when, and it was a real move forward in democratization. A lot of things came out of it, civil rights, women's rights, concern about the environment, opposition to aggression, right up to the present. I'm going to say things like the international solidarity movement and all kinds of things. They're part of the activism of the 60s and its aftermath. And that's, there was an immediate response to that too. It's not discussed much. But across the board, across the spectrum, there was real horror at the 60s. And a lot of it's in print, because they didn't know enough to they didn't figure anyone was going to read these things, so it was published. For example, the one book you should certainly read, if you haven't done so yet, came out in the early 70s by the Trilateral Commission. That's liberal internationalists. That's Carter. That's where his administration came from, Europe, Japan, and the United States. The book's called The Crisis of Democracy. As soon as it came out, I figured this book isn't going to be in print very long, so I got about 20 copies of it and put them in the MIT library, and indeed it went out of print pretty soon, but I think it came out later when people had forgotten. But what the book was very frank. It said the 60s, this is the liberal side of the spectrum, it said the 60s were a dangerous period. It was a period in which people who are usually passive and apathetic and obedient became kind of engaged and started pressing their interests and concerns in the political arena. And this led to an excess of democracy, which is unacceptable. And we have to have more moderation in democracy. And it proposed various methods to do that. Some of them involved the universities right now, in fact. One of the things they were concerned about was the institutions, I'm quoting now, the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. The schools, the universities, the churches, they weren't doing their job. These kids were, look what they're doing. So we have to be stricter in indoctrination of the young. And if you look at what happened after that, and we're now seeing it, a number of things were done. One of them was to try to ensure that students would come out of college with a heavy debt. That has a disciplinary effect. So, tuition started shooting up and all sorts of other things. And in fact, you now have what the press is denouncing as riots in, say, California and other places, because people can't afford to go to school. In fact, California, maybe the richest place in the world, is destroying its the best public education system anywhere. They've raised the tuition so high that it's practically like private universities. And it's very likely that the jewels and the crown, Berkeley and UCLA, will probably be privatized. They're virtually private now. and they'll become kind of Ivy League colleges, and the rest of the system will decline. It's kind of low-level state colleges. Well, students are protesting, so they're rioting. They're terrible, more of this terror. And many other methods have been used, and interestingly, they haven't succeeded. The activism's continued, and it's grown. I mentioned the international solidarity movement, but remember that that's a movement from the 80s, and incidentally, mostly church-based. It came from, not from the elite universities, it came from the Midwest, Southwest, a lot of it from evangelical churches, and it spread. There's now an international solidarity movement all over the world. There was never anything like that before, and many other things. So I just don't agree with the premises. I think a lot's happened, and not enough, it's never enough, but it means that protest and activism today can start from a much higher plane. We've got a legacy that we can use. I mean, propaganda will try to tell you nothing's happened, but anyone who was alive in the 50s, say, knows quite a lot has happened. I mean, take, say, Princeton. I mean, I was here 50 years ago. There were no women, nor at MIT for that matter. Okay.
MIT was always co-ed.
Technically, but MIT had, when I got there in the 50s, I mean, there's like, maybe 10 women around. So yeah, technically it was co-ed. But now it's 50% women, a third minorities, informal relations, dress, a lot of activism. And that happened everywhere. Okay, these things civilized the country. Not enough, but a lot. And they're bitterly opposed, naturally. The elites don't like to lose power and authority. They don't like the decline in the ability of the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young to do their work properly. But that's all to the good. So I think we don't have to, what you can ask whether what's happening is fast enough to deal with the problems that are arising, and maybe not. I mean, after all, there are real crises coming, and maybe the trajectory of change is too slow. Well, if that's true, it will be the beetles and the bacteria who'll talk about it in their way. But we don't have to assume that. And as to how to go ahead, we know exactly how to do it. There aren't a lot of ways, just the ways that have always been used.
Do you not agree that despite all the intention and the ideologies behind the war on terror, it's an amazing opportunity right now in Afghanistan and Pakistan to come up with a constitutional foundation that can at least put these countries on the right track for democratic development? And do you think it's actually happening? And if it's not happening, what is the responsibility of the people who would like this to happen, or what kind of action they can take?
So is what's happening putting them on the path to development? Well, what's called counterinsurgency, which is as old as the hills. I mean, it's talked about as some new story. It's better than just massacring people. Will it do anything? Well, just take a look at the small print, sometimes not so small, in the current reports about Marja. Okay, that was the first big experiment in the grand new theories. Marines went in, cleared the place out, brought in a couple of Afghan officials. The first one they brought in was the vice president. This is a Pashtun area, who's Hazarite, doesn't even speak the language, so we know what he's talking about. Then they brought in Karzai yesterday. It's in this morning's paper. And just take a look at the comments of the people. What they say is, the way it's put is, the past Afghan government was terrible. But notice that they refer to it as the government of the warlords. That's the US-backed government. That's the current parliament, the parliament of the warlords. That's what they're complaining about. And they say, we don't like the Taliban, but at least it was peaceful, and there was some kind of justice and so on. You guys just terrorized and tortured us. Why should we put any faith in you? And the reporters say, well, it's, and the Marine commanders, well, look how much progress there is. At least Karzai can come here and get yelled at. But Will it change anything? You know, I mean, I wouldn't lay bets on it. And besides, it's none of our business. This is what Afghans should decide. And it's not up to, Obama had this, there's a lot of discussion about the long period of deliberation he went through to decide how to change policy, and that shows how great he is and so on. Now, there were some voices missing in those deliberations, pretty notably. There wasn't a single Afghan. They just don't have a voice in deciding what our policy should be for their country. And interestingly, I don't think anyone even noticed it. Why should they have a voice? You know, they're like those Haitian niggers. You know? We decide what we're going to do for them. Well, they have voices. In fact, they're pretty eloquent. Maybe you've read, I don't know if you've read Malalai Joyaf, just to take one example. Is Afghan woman who's a very courageous woman. She's lived through the Russian invasion, the U.S.-backed warlords who were so horrible that the population welcomed the Taliban. They lived under the Taliban, lived under the return of the warlords, survived somehow, doing really good things, you know, educational programs in the rural areas for women and so on and so forth. She was elected to Parliament, kicked out because she was criticizing the warlords. And she writes, she speaks, she tours the United States. And I think she probably speaks for a lot of Afghans. She you know, don't have any way of testing it, but she probably does. And she says, yeah, we need an invasion. We need an invasion of schools, hospitals, roads, not an invasion of tanks and guns. Well, there is an Afghan peace movement. Again, you can't measure how significant it is, but they've had you know, big conferences. They get backing in Germany, not here. And you know, they have similar proposals. There are also ideas from leading specialists, mainstream specialists, like Barnett Rubin and others, who say we're going about everything totally the wrong way. If you really want to achieve anything, you're going to have to leave it to the Afghans and bring in the countries that have a stake in what happens there, not run it yourself. Now, the countries that have a stake in what happens there are Iran, India, Pakistan, China, Russia. They have to be brought in, and they don't like the idea of most of them of NATO bases there, major NATO bases there. So you know, they ought to be brought in if you're going to be an international approach. So there are things you could do. You know, in fact, the same is true of you know, it's all tied in with Pakistan. Pakistan is a horror show. Again, another one of Reagan's achievements in large measure. Pakistan has a pretty ugly history, but also good things. You know. Strong democracy movements and so on. Pakistan has had a series of dictators. The worst of them was in the 1980s, Zia-ul-Haq. He was Reagan's special darling. The Reagan administration was pouring in aid to help him carry out radical Islamization of the country with Saudi funding, and sort of all the madrasas come from and so on. The Reagan administration was also pretending that they didn't know that he was developing nuclear weapons, because they wanted, if he'd done that, Congress would have put restrictions on it. So now, thankfully, we have another nuclear weapons state with a radical Islamist sector. This was being done theoretically to defend Afghanistan, but if you look back, what was going on was pretty straight. The CIA station chief in Islamabad in the 1980s just explained what we're doing. He said, our goal here is to kill Russians. It's not going to help with the liberation of Afghanistan, and that's none of our business, and you could see that when the Russians withdrew and they left it to the warlords. But we're going to be able to kill Russians this way. So if Afghanistan goes down the tube and Pakistan goes down the tube, who cares? Well, okay, we're kind of left with that. You know, the two states in the world that are the most extreme centers of radical Islamism and jihadism are Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, you know, our long-standing allies. I mean, that's not the way, and Britain as well has been cultivating radical Islamists for decades.